Here are key points made in a debate that took place in 2008 at the Oxford Museum of Natural History between atheist Richard Dawkins and Christian John Lennox, both Oxford professors, both prominent spokespersons for their respective worldviews. I'm reasonably sure that in 2025, both men hold to the very same positions, arguments, and insights as they did in 2008. I offer commentary leaning towards Lennox on the issue of a God's existence, but leaning towards Dawkins on the issue of the archaic Christian God's existence. Which God?
The question, as we begin, is, has science buried God?
Well, which God? I mean, we could take Einstein's God, which is not really a personal God at all, but which is a sort of poetic metaphor for the mystery, that which we don't understand about the universe. We could take a deist God, a sort of God of the physicists, a God of somebody like Paul Davies, who devised the laws of physics, God the mathematician, God who put together the cosmos in the first place and then sat back and watched everything happen. And that would be, the deist God would be one that I think it would be, one could make a reasonably respectable case for that, not a case that I would accept, but I think it is a serious discussion that we could have.
I call myself a soft theist. I believe in the probability of a general God not tied to any particular religion. A God who, in practical terms, acts very much like a deist God, but who ultimately does care like a theist God. The Christian God.
In particular, he believes that the creator of the universe, the God who devised the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics, the physical constants, who devised the parsecs of space, billions of light years of space, billions of years of time, that this paragon of physical science, this genius of mathematics, couldn't think of a better way to rid the world of sin than to come to this little speck of cosmic dust and have himself tortured and executed so that he could forgive himself. That is profoundly unscientific. Not only is it unscientific, it doesn't do justice to the grandeur of the universe. It's petty and small-minded, and that's the God that John Lennox believes in.
I don't agree with the atheist idea that our little speck of life here on Earth, set against the vastness of the universe, makes it insignificant. On the contrary, I think Earth, as the only planet we know of so far that has intelligence on it, makes Earth pretty special. But I do agree with Dawkins that the Christian narrative is irrational and primitive.
And you say that God becoming human and Christ dying on a cross and rising from the dead is petty. I think the exact opposite. It's not petty, because it deals seriously with the fundamental problem that I don't think atheism even begins to deal with, and that is the problem of our alienation with God.
In general terms, if God took human form and died a horrible death himself to affirm the value of love and of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, and affirm that he cares about us to a profound level, then that makes good sense to me and is not at all petty. But the thing is, there is a lot more to Christianity than the broad outline of loving your neighbor. I agree with Dawkins that Jesus being a human sacrifice to pay for the sins of humanity, to appease God on some sort of cosmic balance sheet, is primitive nonsense. A man can give his life to show others a better way to live, like Martin Luther King maybe, but he cannot pay for the sins of others. That's constructed theological nonsense. The intelligibility of the universe.
We both believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. I believe the universe is rationally intelligible because there's a creator God behind it. Now, how do you account for the rational intelligibility of the universe?
Darwin came along and showed that it's not actually a freak accident, but nor is it designed. There's a third way, which in the case of biology is evolution by natural selection, which produces a close imitation of something that is designed. It's not designed. We know that now. We understand how it happened. But it looks very designed. Now, the cosmos hasn't yet had its Darwin. We don't yet know how the laws of physics came into existence, how the physical constants came into existence. The point that I've made over and over again is that even if we don't understand how it came about, it's not helpful to postulate a creator, because the creator is the very kind of thing that needs an explanation.
I understand what Dawkins means by saying it is not helpful to postulate a creator to understand our world. To posit God as the explanation for lightning, for example, is not useful at all. But positing a God as an ultimate explanation is reasonable to me. Otherwise, you get an infinite regress of physical causes. For everything in the world, there is an antecedent cause. But if there is no God, no uncaused first cause, you end up with an infinite regress of purely physical causes. Science never ends. Accepting that scenario makes less sense to me than positing a God to stop that infinite regress of physical causes.
How do they serve truth?
Truth.
Depth of truth, how do they come to recognize things like truth if those thoughts are simply reducible to physics and chemistry and neurophysiology? How do they serve truth?
Truth is what happens. An animal that was attempting to survive and that didn't recognize truth or falsehood in some sense at whatever level is appropriate for the kind of survival that it has, it wouldn't survive. I mean, truth just means that you're living in the real world and you behave in the real world in such a way as things make sense in the real world. When you see a rock in your way, you don't go charging into it. You'd die if you did that. If you jumped over a cliff, you'd die. That's truth. It's perfectly obvious that natural selection would favor in any animal a brain that behaves in a way that recognizes truth and acts upon it. Natural selection is a mechanical, blind, automatic force. It's not, I can't say it's not guided, but there's no need for it to be guided. The whole point is that it works without guidance.
The way I see it is that natural selection is guided. It is guided by the laws of nature. And the laws of nature were created by a God, a designer. So while evolution doesn't need a God to directly guide it, it is still ultimately guided by the laws of nature, which God set up. Whether that whole setup, the whole design of the world, is rational or kind in human terms is a separate issue, which I think favors the atheist position. 99% of all species of animals on Earth have gone extinct. That is not a particularly rational way for God to construct life. It's certainly not a kind way. Do we need an agent?
It seems to me that the impression I'm getting is that what's coming through is that the whole process is so sophisticated, it itself is giving evidence of a rational mind behind it.
But let me go back to what you were saying before about guidance. When you drop a stone, it falls to the ground, and you as a scientist will explain that by gravity. you wouldn't dream of saying, oh, there must be a God pushing it down. That's exactly what you're in effect saying with respect to evolution.
When Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, marvelous, now I can know how it works, I don't need God. God is an explicator at the level of an agent, not a mechanism. So that we can study mechanisms in biology. The more sophisticated they are, the more that might well point towards an agent. You don't argue away the existence of an agent by showing that there is a mechanism. And I don't quite understand how you manage to get, if I understand you right, God and science as alternative explanations.
Well, I think you do get rid of an agent if the agent is superfluous to the explanation.
I think this is a key point. The difference between explaining how something works in terms of a mechanism versus why it works in terms of an agent. Different ways of thinking. Dawkins, the scientist, would say, given the laws of nature, you don't need a superfluous agent. Lennox, the religionist, might say, okay, but you need a cause or agent for those very laws of nature. I came across a good analogy. There are some mice living in a piano. The mice understand that the sound the piano makes comes from a hammer thing hitting various strings. But one of the mice realizes that there is a piano player and that she is the real cause, the agent behind the sounds they hear. Must language or information come from a mind?
Now, life, as we both know, has got this digital database. It's got a language all of its own. Now, the only thing we know of capable of producing language is mind. And yet you reject that.
When you say the only thing we know that can produce language is mind, I mean, we know that what produces human language is mind. Of course we do, because that's human language. But DNA is not human language.
Yeah, but I think you said this somewhere in a different context, junk in, junk out. Here we have this phenomenally sophisticated information processor, which is the cell. Am I really to believe that that information processing capacity simply came about by the laws of nature and random processes without a mind?
Yes.
Well, absolutely. I find that impossible to believe as a mathematician.
I know you do. This is called the argument from personal incredulity.
But I could just reverse that and says your position is the argument from personal credulity. No, that rationality comes from irrationality, that mind comes from matter, when there is no explanation for the existence of the universe. Do you just believe the universe is a brute fact?
The universe is an easier brute fact to accept than a conscious creator.
Well, who made it?
I lean towards positing a creator as the more plausible brute fact. The universe popping into existence without cause, a universe having made itself, seems less plausible to me.
This extreme reductionism removes from me the very rationality which we use to have the discussion. So that I'm not simply terribly tempted to believe it's all been designed. I believe it's all been designed, but that doesn't, and here's something else that I'd like to bring up in this, that doesn't stop science. I fear sometimes that your dichotomy, either God or science, might put some people off science because they'd prefer God, and that would be a pity.
Historically speaking, I think Dawkins has good cause to denigrate religion as a hindrance to science. But these days, I think that is no longer as strong a criticism, because most of modern Christianity pretty much accepts science as the arbiter of physical reality. Even the Catholic Church does not deny evolution. Though it should be noted, it took them until 1996 before they officially pronounced it acceptable. which kind of affirms Dawkins' criticism that for most of history, Christianity has been a significant hindrance to science. Yes, great scientists of the past like Newton and Galileo were Christians, but Christianity has had a tendency to oppose rather than support science in cases where it would threaten their power or contradict the Bible. And most importantly, the Bible, the alleged Word of God, puts forth false science. It says the earth is set on pillars, which it is not. It says plants existed before the sun was created, which is impossible. It says Jesus healed people by driving out demons. Those kinds of blundering ideas do not advance science. Religion is very prone to trying to hold on to its power and authority at the expense of science. I read a good book years ago called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom by Andrew Dixon White. One thing I remember was how the church refused for years to use an invention by Benjamin Franklin, the lightning rod, to protect their churches because they wanted people to pray instead during lightning storms and not use science. In the meantime, countless churches were damaged and numerous bell ringers killed. Even today, Christianity generally opposes stem cell research despite how much good it has done. The God of the gaps.
I can't explain the origin of life at the moment. I mean, nobody can. People are working on it.
But you believe that it will have a naturalistic solution?
Yes, I think that it is a cowardly cop-out to suggest that just because we don't yet understand something, therefore magic did it.
Oh, well, I would agree with that. I mean, the God of the gaps idea.
Well, but that's exactly what you're putting forward, the God of the gaps. You're saying, you're pointing to the origin of life, you're pointing to the origin of DNA and saying, oh, well, okay, Darwin's done everything after the origin of life, but he hasn't done the origin of life.
No,
that's the God of the gaps.
Your assumption, as I understand it, is that there's going to be an exhaustive, reductionist, naturalistic explanation of everything in scientific terms. I don't think so.
Lennox is agreeing that we should not resort to God of the gaps thinking to explain life. That would indeed be anti-science. But he is suggesting that it is reasonable to posit a God of the ultimate final gap as the agent behind it all. That actually sounds okay to me. That's how I think. However, the relevant point here is that even though Lennox himself espouses that mindset of not resorting to God or magic to explain things, his religion does exactly that. The Bible is rife with God of the gaps magical thinking, superstition, assumed miracles, multiplied loaves of bread, blind people suddenly healed, people raised from the dead, Hebrews waltzing through the Red Sea, sheep producing streaked offspring by putting peeled branches in front of the sheep. And yes, the Bible specifically condemns practices like divination, fortune-telling, sorcery, and consulting with mediums, but not because it regards these things as the BS of con artists, which is what they are, but because it regards them as real and dangerous. The Bible narrates Jesus performing exorcisms of demons on 7 separate occasions. Belief in literal demons as the cause of illness is as anti-scientific as you can get. Where is justice to be found?
In your world, where is justice to be found?
Well, justice is a human construct of great importance in human affairs, and it's something that we have most of us have a sense of, which I think probably can be given some sort of Darwinian explanation, but I don't see where you're taking this.
Well, if there is no God, then there's no ultimate justice. And one of the things that the resurrection transforms for me from pettiness right into center stage is, if this is true, then there's real hope that there be a rational evaluation and fair justice at the end of the world. But atheism doesn't give you that.
Okay, suppose there is no hope, suppose there is no justice, suppose there's nothing but misery and darkness and bleakness, suppose there is nothing that we would wish for, nothing that we would hope for. Too bad. That doesn't make it true just because God would make us feel good.
Well, of course it doesn't.
Well, then why do you bring that argument up?
Because I believe that there is evidence that it is true.
If you could possibly persuade me that there was some kind of creative force in the universe, there was some kind of physical, mathematical genius who created everything, the expanding universe, devised quantum theory, relativity, and all that. You could possibly persuade me of that. But that is radically and fundamentally incompatible with the sort of God who cares about sin, the sort of God who cares about what you do with your genitals, the sort of God who is interested, who has the slightest interest in your private thoughts and wickednesses and things like that. Surely you can see that a God who's grand enough to make the universe is not going to give a tuppenny cuss about what you're thinking about and your sins and things like that.
So you think that morality is not important?
Of course I don't think morality is not important. I'm a human being.
Sounds like you're saying it isn't important.
I'm a human being, and I live in a society of human beings, and within it.
I think Dawkins perceives a hypothetical God as too big to bother about everything we little humans do and think. But I tend to agree with Lennox here that God, being all-powerful, has no problem knowing everything about us, and does care about someone stealing even a small item.
And that's so unconvincing.
Yeah.
I think there's something wonderful about standing up and facing up to a universe where we are increasing our understanding, and we throw away childhood obsessions, we throw away the sort of imaginary friend that comforts us when we're children, and we feel the need for some kind of parent figure to turn to. I think when we grow up, we need to cast that aside and stand up tall in the universe. And it's cold, and we're not going to last for it. We're going to die, and we face up to that. And I think that's a nobler way of getting through life than to pin your hopes on childhood illusions.
But that all rests on the assumption that there's no God and they're childhood delusions.
Yes, well, we have
But
to
I
look at
could
the
invert
evidence.
that. That's a typical Freudian explanation,
Yeah.
but one's atheism could be exactly that.
Yeah.
A flight away from the reality that there is a God. So we're back.
The vast majority of atheists I know do not disbelieve in God because they are fleeing from God and want to be their own God and want to commit sin. That's the self-serving Christian narrative that I hear repeatedly. Instead, I find atheists disbelieve in a God simply because God does not honestly make sense to them. The God that I believe in understands the validity of their position and does not reject them because of their lack of belief. He accepts them if they are good people. The God I believe in is not an anthropomorphic cosmic egotist like the Christian God is. Miracles.
When you look at history, and let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed. However, if you're going to say that Jesus was born of a virgin, that Jesus walked on water, that he turned water into wine, that is palpably anti-scientific. There is no evidence for that.
when you say it's anti-scientific, I don't think it's anti-scientific at all. Science cannot say that miracles do not occur. It can say they're highly improbable.
Yeah, so improbable that for all intents and purposes, miracles do not occur. The laws of nature reign. My conviction is that there are no breach of nature miracles, but that life itself is a miracle.
When you say it's anti-scientific, I think it's not anti-scientific.
What I mean by that is that if, and when doing science, we constantly have to keep in mind that at any moment there might be a little magic trick slipped in, that would completely nullify the whole enterprise of science.
Oh, I agree with that. But
well,
you see,
but that's what you're allowing then.
No, I'm not allowing that at all, because in order to recognize what the New Testament calls miracle, a special act of God, you must be living in a universe that has regularities and that we recognize them. I agree with you entirely.
Otherwise you wouldn't notice the miracles.
That's exactly true. You wouldn't recognize if dead people were popping up all over the place. You wouldn't think it was very special. And ancient historians, and this has fascinated me recently going over it, ancient historians whose discipline is very venerable, and I'm not talking about Christian ancient historians, many of them, even at the skeptical end of the spectrum, say that the evidence for the resurrection of Christ is very powerful. The explosion of the Christian church from a non-proselytizing group of Jews in the first century, the empty tomb and all the rest of it, has even led Geza Vermesh, who's one of the most distinguished ancient historians in Oxford, to say, yes, this tomb was empty and hallucinated.
Yeah, that the tomb was empty, but not that he actually rose from the dead. Lennox is putting a Christian spin on things. Note how Lennox talks as though ancient scholars generally accepted Jesus' resurrection when they did no such thing. They just accepted his existence and the existence of the Christian movement, not his resurrection. Tacitus regarded Christianity as a mischievous superstition.
That is deeply against the spirit of science, and I don't think I could do science if I thought that at any time something like the resurrection, something like the virgin birth was going to be smuggled in by a godly caprice.
Meaning?
I suppose the basic question for me here is, what is the nature of ultimate reality? If ultimate reality is simply the universe in some sense, or multiverse, that's one thing. And I am at a loss to understand how you get from simple atoms, elementary particles, and so on, to a brain, let alone a mind, the I, the person. And we don't understand what consciousness is, and so on. I don't begin to say, and I don't think scientists begin to see, how you can get to something that even understands the concept of meaning. But I can understand it if behind the universe, the ultimate reality is not impersonal matter and energy that somehow has produced all this stuff bottom up. I can understand it if it's top down, as well as partly bottom up. And
gentlemen, I think we digress.
Yeah. Okay.
The issue again is purpose.
I want to hear that ending. I want to hear whether he believes in evolution.
Well, I've said that I believe in what Darwin observed, but I'm not sure that the mechanism of mutation and natural selection can bear all the weight that's put on it. For example, producing consciousness and so on. I think there may be several points in the history of the universe where God did something special.
What's special about Christianity?
That tends to diverge. There are some religions that say that a relationship with God must be based on human merit, and as many probably know, Christianity says the exact opposite, that the relationship with God comes through trusting Christ because of what he did through his cross and resurrection, and is not merit but is a gift
Here is where I emphatically disagree with Lennox and Christianity, that the ultimate virtue is belief, trusting in Christ, and not merit being the ultimate virtue. Merit, that is good behavior, is the ultimate virtue. I think Christianity is horribly misguided here. The lousy thief on the cross goes to heaven because he believes. But millions of decent atheists and people of other faiths go to hell because they do not believe. I think it is deeply immoral to believe in such a cultish morality. I respect Dawkins a lot. I cannot respect Lennox because there's something fundamentally dishonest about what he does, what most Christians do, which is to focus on the positive aspects of Christianity and soft pedal so many of the negatives that disprove Christianity, like male chauvinism, contradictions to science, false prophecies, bigotry towards gays, overselling the power of faith and prayer, predicting the end of the world in Jesus' generation erroneously, valuing belief over behavior, as mentioned, contradicting its own assertions, condoning immoral ideas like slavery, and teaching the obscenely cruel concept of hell.
And I think it's very important that we respect people of other faiths. But if
you see how Lennox talks a good game, but simply ignores what the Bible actually says. John 3:18 says very clearly that he who does not believe goes to hell. That is not respecting people of other faiths, pronouncing that they're going to be tortured forever if they don't agree with Christianity. How do you explain the laws of physics?
To Professor Dawkins, how do you explain the origin of the laws of physics?
I do not know the origin of the laws of physics, as I've said again and again. What I do know is that whatever they are, and I've said this again and again, whatever they are, it certainly doesn't help to propose that they were designed by a conscious intelligence.
I agree that it doesn't help to use God as an explanation for specific physical things or processes. But for me, the essence of life lies not in physical things, but in emotional experiences. I perceive emotions as a greater ultimate reality than molecules. Was the boulder that killed your best friend a greater reality than your friendship? It would not be so for me.
I would hold up Darwin as a model for the whole of science. Then we have every hope that science will solve it for the other problems in the end. And even if it doesn't, even if science doesn't solve all problems ever, that is still no grounds for saying, oh, well, magic did it.
I think the infinite march of science is grounds for positing God as an ultimate explanation. Otherwise, you get an infinite regress of purely physical causes. I read that Elvis Presley once said something which I found to be quite profound. That in order to be happy, you have to have three things: someone to love, something to do, and something to look forward to. That third one is very important. So if the existence of a general God and an afterlife makes sense to you, and if that God's entire theology is for you to be a good person, if that God turns out not to exist, you have nevertheless, in my opinion, still chosen a good game plan for your life. Pascal's wager, without the negative baggage of traditional religion. I'll finish with a fun fact. Two of my favorite historical people were born on the very same day: Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin, February 12, 1809. Thanks for watching.